It was 6 o'clock in the morning. I was fast asleep in bed still, and my phone rang, and it was my wife. And of course, right away, your mind goes to some pretty interesting places. I pick up and she says, something's wrong with the car. I just pulled out of the driveway. I'm on the street. I think I've got a flat tire. Something's wrong. I can't really turn the wheel, and it sounds like there's a loud noise under the car. You got to come check it out. So I get outside in a haze, and first glance, tires look fine. Second glance, it looks like the car is on airbags and the front driver's wheel is tucked way up into the fender. And I go, oh, it's probably something suspension. Worst case scenario, maybe an engine mount blowout. I don't know. Let's see. Let's pull it into the garage and take a look. I take the S4 off the quick jacks and then quickly throw the Avant up there. And it takes about 4 seconds after I take the wheel off to realize, yep, Alberta winters have struck again. And I have a shattered spring. So I jumped into the teardown right away. Now this is not some made up YouTube drama. This car is our daily battle wagon. My wife drives it to work every single day. We depend on it both days on the weekend. You can tell that I have a bunch of other non-running vehicles in the garage. It's an important car, and I wasn't about to just call a flatbed, ship it off to the dealer or a shop and hope for the best. This thing needs to get back on the road. And you know, I have the means, I have some tools and space and some good stuff now to take care of projects like this. So I did. I got into it and I started tearing a whole bunch of stuff apart because I think you guys know me at this point. When I see a bit of rust here or something broken there, I'm not just looking at replacing one spring. Plus, that's not really how you're supposed to do suspension changes. You should typically do things in pairs or, you know, both rears, both fronts kind of thing. And I decided that more did need to be done. You already saw the video title and thumbnail. You know what this is about. We're going full-blown coilovers on the wagon, which is crazy. Look how nice this stuff is. It's way too good for this car. This is like our worst vehicle in the garage. But you'll see in a second why this truly is necessary. Now that you're invested in the journey here, let me just take a second to welcome you to the channel. Hi, my name is Steve. This is Figured Audi. Here I do work on my A4 wagon, S8 and S4, doing maintenance and modifications, and from time to time some product and tool reviews. And today's video definitely falls within the modification category. This is not just a step-by-step DIY because the removal is done, and I will talk about that in a second. But there are great resources on the internet that I encourage you to look at. ECS has a great guide, FCP Euro has a good video on it, and we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is a bit of a cooking show install today of the coilovers. You know how they have all the ingredients ready and the pan's hot and you're ready to go? That's what I've done here. We're ready to put these things on, but there is work involved. So I'm going to take you through how to install these ECS Tuning coilovers on your A4, S4, B8, and then we're going to do a little bit of tuning. There's going to be an alignment done, and then we'll do a road test as well. I'm willing to bet that in your mind, when you think about coilovers, you think about lots of awesome adjustability, and they look sweet, and of course the car will be lower after if you want to do that, but you're thinking about the price tags. Well, let me show you what came off of the car and what was wrong with it, and let's talk a little bit of money here. That's what it comes down to in some cases, because once we start looking at the individual replacement part cost, well, coilovers actually become a better value. Let's look at ground zero of what was happening here, the sheared spring. Now, I definitely attribute this to tough winters. You know, we have crazy heat cycles of seasons. We get up to plus 40 degrees in the summer, I'm talking Celsius, and down to minus 40 in the winter. We salt our roads. They're very tough conditions, and what I can see right now where the spring sheared was it was rusted. It cracked through the enamel that was on the outside of the coating. It started to rust through. There was a bit of a fissure in there, and then snap. As soon as the strut was out, I could see that the perch itself was extremely rusted, and even if the spring didn't break, if that continued to decay, the pressure from the spring above could have blown out the edges here and it would have hopped the perch anyways. But I also saw the bottom. Now this part is exposed. It sticks through this little fork right here, and this thing was getting eaten away too on both of them. And can you imagine what would happen there if your hydraulic shock started leaking and actually ruptured? You would have been screwed doubly. As if I didn't already have enough hesitations after taking apart the front suspension. By the time I got to the rears with the shocks that actually travel closest to the ground on these cars, I was pretty much certain I was going to need to replace everything. This one was super corroded. And the driver's side was even worse. The corrosion was heavy at the bottom and traveled almost the entire length of the shock. I mentioned these items because of the price, but my end links, the bushings were pretty much shot. The hardware, if it's not already torqued to yield, mine was toast anyways. Oddly enough, all my rubber components were actually pretty good. So I'm talking about the bump stops at the top of the rear shocks, the rubber mount inside of the housing itself, more bump stops on the front, and then of course we have these really big rubber bushings at the top of the strut housing. They were pretty good. I don't know if someone's been in here before, but I would have expected those to be deteriorated. It kind of doesn't matter though, because the point is when you get into this work, you're not just replacing a strut or a shock and a spring. You got to think about all the things that need to be replaced at the same time. All the prices I'm going to talk about are in US dollars because I am assuming that's where you are and you have free shipping to your door. I absolutely do not, but I have to come to terms with that over time as a Canadian. Anyways, let's look at the full package. So if you were to replace it with OEM stuff and just like run-of-the-mill kind of items, springs are looking at about 50 to 60 bucks per spring. So let's say conservatively here, you got $200 worth of replacement. Hardware is pretty easy to forget, but a lot of this stuff is torque to yield and you should probably just replace it anyways to make sure there's fresh stuff down there. Another 100 bucks. Now for the shocks and struts, you are probably going to be tempted at this point to go to Bilstein and pick out some of their nicer items. They have the B8 line. They also have the 6 and 4s, and that's from like the high-end sporty to the OEM quality. And for a full kit of shocks and struts, it'll probably run you from $500 to $800. And we haven't even talked about the rubber yet. You know, we have rubber mounts on the top of here. We have these guys at the very top there, all of your bump stops. And there's probably a few other things I'm forgetting, and that's gonna run you easily another 100, 150. Of course, I left out end links there. Those are something that should become more necessary, especially if you're gonna lower your car, which I am gonna be doing here. But let's just say the most conservative parts that you could have picked from that list I just mentioned, it's gonna run you about $800 for that full package. Now for only $700 on sale right now, you can get ECS Tuning's in-house designed and developed coilover system that they make available for a ton of different German cars. And that is a heck of a good value for what you get. Now, we're not going to talk about end links this second. That is not included. That was extra that I picked up. But what you get is the 2 rear springs, 2 rear shocks, and then the 2 all-in-one coil-over struts. Living in the prairies means that we have rough winters. You've already seen what happens as a result of that. So I appreciate some of the product design work that's gone into these coilovers because there's lots to do with protection here. And I'll show you the highlights. On the bottom, we have black powder coating over the bottom of the bodies, which is great because these stick out underneath the car and sees probably the most abuse out of any other part. Then we have the red anodized billet aluminum adjustment collars for both the spring preload and then also to lock in the actual shock bodies themselves. And then the threads, this is a big one. This is clear zinc coated because you'll notice on a few different cars, if you go back like a year or two later to reset your coilover height, you actually can't get anything spinning because it's all crusted over. And the last item here is the powder coating on the springs themselves. It's gray and actually just generally aesthetically speaking, I really like the color combinations going on here. I also popped off for the end links. They were on sale at the time for $120 per pair, give or take. And the fronts are fully adjustable with a nice strong ball joint at the bottom and a poly bushing for the top. The rears are solid billet aluminum with double spherical bearings. Now, if at this point end links just seem like an additional optional cost to you, they're kind of not. I would factor them into your project. Obviously, you're getting coilovers to lower your car, and that's going to change the suspension geometry. For example, if an arm was about steady state before, when you lowered the car, everything's going to be pitched up a little bit, and that's going to travel and put tension on parts that don't have tension on them before, namely bushings throughout your control arms that'll wear out prematurely if you don't do something about it. Not that end links solve all of that, but there will be additional load put onto your sway bar if you try to connect it to your factory links. And with an adjustable or at least a spherical system that can reach to different places than your OEM ones could have, it helps alleviate some of that. There's 2 things I have to call out about these ECS Tuning coilovers because it's actually great that you get them for the price point. There are cheaper ones, maybe a couple $100 cheaper on the market that you actually don't get very much for. And then of course there's ones that are 2-3 times more expensive that you get all the adjustability in the world, but they're that much more expensive. So check this out. The first is the fact that you are able to set a spring preload. There are some coilovers out there that are cheaper that you actually don't get this. You would have just one collar that essentially pushes up against the spring to make sure it's not flopping around, but it also sets your ride height. That is a really bad way to do it. What you want is something like this, where one collar is locking in against the threads to the body itself to set that ride height. Then you have other ones to actually put a pre-amount of tension and compression on the spring itself. The second feature, and by far the most unique one for this price point of coilover, is the fact that it has a 32 different adjustable setting rebound dampening control. So whereas other coilovers might have the additional compression adjustability, so it might have like 2 knobs or a separate way to manage that, in this type of system, it's actually the spring itself that's basically doing the spring rate of compression. And as it returns back to a ride height, that's where you get to tune it to be soft or hard, whether it comes up fast or slow. Of course, I'm massively simplifying here. There's tons of science that goes into spring rates. These ones are actually progressive spring rates. So just go Google that. Also go Google how hydraulic fluid works inside of a shock monotube. There's lots to be learned there. When you come back, let's get into what I encountered on the car and get this installation going. Like I said, there are tons of good resources out there to help you DIY the uninstallation, but I wanted to share just a couple of really poignant things with you because this uninstallation was no joke. I took, I'd say about 2.5, maybe 3 full days of quite a bit of work to get this stuff apart, but I think I had it like as bad as you can possibly get it. My point here is leave yourself some time to do this job. If you think you're going to step into the garage and knock out an uninstallation and the install of a coilover set in like an afternoon on a Sunday, that's not going to be the case. Give yourself some buffer time. Practically speaking though, it's going to be that upper pinch bolt that is seized for 95% of you. It certainly was for me, and it took me 2 hours per pinch bolt to get out. It was so aggravating, and you can throw all your usual tricks at it, but I'll tell you exactly what worked for me, which was a map torch and heat. So ultimately what I depended on was heating up the spindle itself just enough, just to expand maybe like less than 1 millimeter to give me enough wiggle room on that bolt in there, because it's not threaded inside of the hole. The bolt should theoretically just slide right out. Expand it just enough so I could take a punch and a hammer from the opposite side and slowly smash it out. I felt like I was going to be Arnold Schwarzenegger at the end of that day. My arm was practically falling off. Major word of caution though, the downside to using heat is that you can very easily burn the boot on your control arms that are going to be stuck in place still. And that's exactly what I did, and that is why I had to buy 2 new control arms, which whatever, I'm resigned to doing anyways. At least I get a fresh bushing on there too and a couple of fresh ball joints, but that will cost you a couple extra bucks, so just be very careful with your heat placement. The rears were a different type of hell. Part of that has to do with the spring itself. There is a lot of spring here. It's not going to look this big when it's in the car because it'll be quite a bit more compressed than that, but you have to get so much room to pop that thing out the bottom. Now, I'm not totally convinced that you need to loosen the rear subframe to drop it. I did do that, but know first of all that those bolts need to be replaced. Those are stretch bolts, are very important. They carry a lot of weight. If you drop that subframe, buy new bolts. They're not really expensive, depending on what split in the B8 production years you have. Thankfully, mine's the cheapo ones with like $5 bolts, so it's not so bad. But that little bit of room will help you, but you are ultimately going to need a spring compressor. This thing right here that I posted on Instagram. And they're a little scary to use. Honestly, I would invest in a better one than I did. I just got like a cheapo 40-buck one from KMS Tools. It did the trick, but they are a little scary. You will need to compress that spring a lot, and you'll need to push down on your spindle and that suspension there a lot to pop this out the bottom. Grab a friend. I did it alone with a couple of pry bars and all my hands and feet working at the same time. Certainly possible, but just be prepared to deal with that rear spring. Finally, before we get into the installation here, PSA, just go spend some time with your car looking in the fender well liners and under the car. You're gonna find some crazy shit, I guarantee it. I actually found a mouse nest on the top of the wheel well liner in the rear. The car must have been sitting for at least some time for that to occur, but it was like a ball of yarn and some shavings, and I'm just really glad I found that. But second of all, I found so much sand and dirt in this little spot right here on both sides of the car. So it's up above the spindle. Normally this is actually pretty much exposed to the elements below the car, but this entire pocket up here was full of sand. In fact, it was so much, and because I'm so particular, I actually saved as much of it as I possibly could because I literally wanted to weigh it and see how much I pulled out of the car. Oh my God, 4.4 pounds worth of dirt. All right, we're gonna start with the fronts, and in order to mount the coilover, you're going to need to reuse a couple of things, namely your control arms and the strut assembly itself. And if you want, you can reuse the bushing. Mine's actually pretty good, and that's what I'm gonna do. Really, all you need to do is take this nut off. Now, to take it off, you could put an impact gun on there, blast it off, no problem. But to put it back on and torque it properly, you're not gonna be able to just send it home like that. You're gonna need a set of specialty tools, of which I now have. This is a kit from Schwaben, was also on sale on ECS Tuning, and it's pretty ingenious, and it takes advantage of the fact that you have to hold the nut still, but there's actually a hex head inside of the fork that goes down into the strut, like the shock body itself. So what you do is take your appropriate size socket that has a big hole in the back, put it on the nut, take their wrench or your wrench, whatever, put it on there to counter hold, find your appropriate hex key, put it down into the top of the strut, and then take a wrench or a breaker bar, whatever you want, and then break it all loose. However, very important step one, which is you need to compress the spring a little bit in order to have some tension relieved so that when you take that nut off, it doesn't come exploding apart and hurt yourself. And that is where the spring compressor tool comes into play again. You're not looking to like massively compress the spring, just enough to take tension off of the top of the assembly so that you can just very slowly normally take that nut off without anything shooting out. And that is exactly what you're gonna watch me do now in a time lapse, which is great because now I can listen to some music in the background while I work. So I'm just gonna be swapping some things over. I've got 2 fresh control arms back here that I'll be putting one on each side for. And generally speaking, I'll just meet you back here when everything is sort of like pre-set up to go into the car. I immediately realized that attaching the spring compressor was going to be difficult given how far the strut assembly sticks outwards from the spring. I removed the upper control arms to get more space and began testing compressor placement and angles. By almost no clearance at all, the winning combination was directly in front and behind of the strut assembly. Even with the spring compressed, I was a little bit scared to remove the top nut in the garage with all the cars around, so I finished that step outside on the lawn. Then it was time to simply load the new coilover into the assembly, add a little pressure to the spring, and start tightening down the new nut. I found it was easier to attach the control arms first to hold the assembly still while doing that final torque. I ran into some tooling issues that I definitely want to share with you right now. That's what this channel is all about. I struggle, you get hindsight benefits. And the close notes of it is that the Schwaben kit does not work for installing the ECS Tuning coilovers. They're fantastic for removing factory hardware from the factory assemblies. But the real problem here comes down to the fact that the smallest hex key size is a 6 mil and the smallest socket size they offer is an 18. So the new nut that's going on to the front assembly is indeed an 18, but the inside hex key size here is a 5 mil. And thankfully I checked the rear and it's actually a 4 mil. This nut, however, though, is 15. So we basically run out of options here and you are simply going to need something like this. So I had to run out and get an extended, like a long set of hex keys. And it goes all the way from like 3 to 10 essentially. And that'll do the counter holding job here when you're attempting to torque this down. And that's the second major problem. I have found it very difficult to consistently put a torque down on this nut with this tooling. You actually need a different type of socket, I believe. You need the strut sockets where the side is open, where you're counter holding the strut, which is what we're doing, except the torque is properly being applied down onto the nut. In the case of the tooling that I'm using right now, the socket goes on top and you're actually putting torque down onto the strut itself, expecting the fact that if you hit that torque value, the same amount of torque is being applied to the nut around it. But that's like not how this works. That's not how fasteners work. So I think I'm pretty close. I got it down like really nice and firm. I can tell the shock's bottomed out, but it is not the way you should probably go about doing it. Don't worry though, I'm gonna make your life easy. Go look in the description of the video right now and you'll see a full list of the tools that I know you'll need for this project and their links to Amazon. But now for a fun part, we get to do some tuning, starting with the adjustment knob for the rebound on the top. Now you may keep your knob on, you might not. I'll talk about that a little bit more for a modification that I'm gonna be doing right after this, but you have to choose your stiffness setting. And keep in mind that you might not have a big cushy wagon like me. If you have an S4 or an S-line that has, sporty suspension, you're going to be picking probably a stiffer setting than I am, and you're going to be adjusting your collars to probably a lower height than I am. I'm still looking for a nice, soft, cushy ride, very comfortable. It's probably going to feel better just because the components are freshened up in the suspension. I don't need to be going for like speed racer status here. So what I'm going to do is right down the middle. I'm going to take my knob and I'm turned all the way to the right to full hard right now.
What did he say?
And I'm just going to back it up 16 clicks to the center. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. That's it. The second element we're going to adjust is the spring preload. Now, I am not a suspension expert. I could not tell you why adding lots of preload might be beneficial in some cases over others. I don't know. All I'm going to do is treat this like an end link. I'm going to put minimal preload on it, basically just enough so that the spring isn't flopping around if there's no compression on it. And then I'm going to adjust it 2 more turns. So quite literally, the spring is loose right now. It's wiggling, not totally tight. I'm going to take this top collar in a second when I can use my wrenches properly. I'm going to spin it up until it's just firm and holding it in place, and then I'm going to do 2 more full rotations, and then I'm going to lock it in place. That is going to be my static setting. The final adjustment we need to make here is the ride height itself. That one's going to be the fun one. Obviously, lots of preference goes into that. I don't actually intend on changing the height of the vehicle between seasons at all. I'm going to be testing later in the video the fitment on whatever the final ride height I choose on both my summer and winter tire packages at the same time to make sure that it works. And essentially what we're doing here is picking how much thread is going to be showing in this section. You're going to measure it. You're going to be measuring from the bottom of the top collar to where the threads end, where the body starts. And we simply adjust this by spinning the shock body itself, and then we'll lock it into place eventually with this collar right here. So I'm going to be going for to start 4 inches from here to here. I'll show you my result to prove the point that you're not going to get this perfectly. You're not a race team. It doesn't need to be absolutely perfect. Here is the 4 inches I said I would set it to. But keep in mind that when you load the bottom of the shock body here into the mount, there's a little notch at the top there because there is a receiving locating dowel right here. But clearly that's on the back and this is on the front, meaning I'm going to have to rotate this another half turn to make it work. So like it's not going to be 100% accurate, but you'll be okay. Just before I hoist these new strut assemblies into place, I'm going to do a modification in the engine bay here to give me access to the little adjustability dampening knob at the very top. I find it a little ironic that if you buy these and if you don't do this modification, then you actually have to take the whole assembly out through the wheel well to try to tune it. And obviously that's not very easy. So what I'm going to do is take a hole saw. It's about 1 3/8 inches, and I am going to core a hole in the center of the shock tower. Again, totally optional. I understand that this is going to be sort of a permanent modification to the car, and you do need to take some care doing this, not only just to keep the metal shavings out of the engine bay, but also it could rust. So touch up paint, rubber grommet, maybe a cap on it too. There's some things that you're going to want to plan for if you're going to do this. It is finally install time, which is awesome. I'm not going to walk you through step by step because ECS Tuning has some really good documentation on their website for this, so you can just follow along like that, just as I am myself. And really it's as simple as like bolts on the top, hang everything down, connect your end link on the top here first because it's hard to manipulate that bushing, so you'll attach the sway bar second, and then just work your way down in hardware. Pinch bolt, and then the big one through the fork and the control arm at the bottom. Super fast tip though, before you get going and things are in the way, take a little file, a round file, send it through the top pinch bolt hole. You're not trying to actually enlarge in that hole, just knock out any of the corrosion that might be in there. And I'm gonna follow it up with a lot of fluid film on the inside to make sure it doesn't seize again. It is a new day, but late last night I finished up the install of the coilovers in the front of the car, and I'm pretty happy. It was not a joke, it took some time, but pretty cool to see the adjustment knobs sticking out of the engine bay here. And I'll just say for now that none of the hardware is truly torqued down. What we want to do is finish up the rears here in a second, and then mount our tires, and then do a test fitting. And then once we're actually happy with the ride height, that's the point where you torque everything down. Once again, I have all my ingredients out for the rear end of the car in front of me, and I anticipate this is actually going to be quite a bit faster than the front. I do want to call out the top mount. I'm going brand new everything, so I can skip a few steps and just have fresh rubber in there, but do note that there's a totally different type of fitting on the top of the shock right here. It's an oval, kinda, sorta. And if you have the Schwaben kit, they have 2 different sizes that you can use to undo that thing, but just don't get caught off guard. It is not an internal Allen at the top. Once again, we get to play tuner and do a couple of adjustments before we start the install. Unsurprisingly, that involves doing the rebound damping, and I have a knob with 32 settings. I'm gonna do the exact same process, go to full hard, back it off 16. Now for height adjustability, it's a different game back here because it is not a coil over a shock. It is a totally independent spring that's maintained its height based on the collar above it, and then the shock does have a collar on its threads, but that's actually just to manage the shock travel. That doesn't set your ride height. You should have brand new hardware for the bottom that goes to the bottom of the shock. My end links are obviously brand new, subframe, and everything else on the top of the shock too. So I really want to call out the subframe bolts. They're obviously torque to yield, and when you see the ribbing on washers like that, you know they're meant to hold a lot of pressure. And I'm telling you this from experience, just do it, spend the money. On my old A4, I did some work around the subframe, took out the bolts, reused them, and I put Loctite on them. And I was surprised when I came back, I think only a couple months later to do a different project, they were loose. I am ready to go with the install, but I have to reveal one of my secrets here. I have the top mounts loaded up onto the shocks, but I had to make my own tool. So whereas the Schwab kit is great for providing these pass-through sockets so you can do the torque, there was no such one that was small as 15. So what I did is I took a deep 15 half-inch drive, so it has lots of meat around the sides, and I took my angle grinder and I just cut 2 straight notches straight down so that I could use a crescent wrench on the side, and then I can pass through my skinny little 4 mil, and I can do the typical counter hold and torque down on the nut. We'll have to take a wild ass guess once again for the ride height, and I'm gonna start with the maximum amount. So I measured it with the spring and this and some other perch items here. The ECS kit for the spring is actually shorter than just the spring itself for the OE spring. And that is not necessarily concerning. It does mean that the ride height's probably gonna be a little lower than I would have liked for this car. But it also means you have to be careful when your suspension is in full droop, whether it's up on a jack like this or you went off of like, I don't know, a really big hump in the ground, that the spring doesn't fall out. So you need to make sure that you're using the adjustment collar on the shock body here to make sure that the entire suspension is up far enough where this is still really secure. Back to time-lapse mode for me. I'm gonna do both of the rears in one shot. What you're gonna see me do is put in the spring assembly. I'm going to re-raise and tighten the subframe. Then I'm gonna use my jack it up, put a little tension on there, put the shocks in, put the end links in, and then it's time for wheel and tire fitment and check out what our ride height's at. First moment of truth, we're gonna see how long my night might be here. I have the summers loaded up on one side, I have the winters on the other. All the suspension is obviously installed at this point, not final torque on the bolts. We're just gonna drop this thing on the ground and see how low it sits and adjust from there. Also, I know I'm very lucky to have the quick jack here. It's gonna make this much more simple. If you are working in your garage with just a set of jack stands and jacks, yeah, that sucks. I feel for you. Every time you have to make an adjustment, you gotta bring the whole car up. Whereas I just get to hit a button here, so let's bring her down. Whoa, look at that. Oh man. It's a little lower than I thought. Well, so much for the utility of ground clearance. I don't know what I was thinking, actually, in hindsight. Like, obviously, the highest point on a coilover is going to be lower than a typical stock setup, but it looks pretty sick. Like, it is low, but, you know, not even close to tucked. Like, there's still lots of good room up in the fender there. I haven't made measurements from the hub to the fender yet, but this is looking really good. In terms of the winters here on the side, on the rear, this is, you know, acceptable. Obviously, this is not exactly winter spec, but plenty of room in here. The fronts are a bit of a different story. I don't think this is fantastic. I might have to actually raise it in the winter if this is as low as it's going to be in the summer. I think it's like okay right now. I don't think there would be any rubbing. Obviously, I'll go for a quick little road test here with 2 different sets of tires, which is okay. But that wasn't exactly the outcome I wanted. I wanted something that was going to be good year round. So I guess I could raise the fronts a little bit, considering they can still go up, but the rears are as high as they can be. So I'm going to make a quick little adjustment in the front. What I've decided to do is match basically the fender gap. So there's 1.25 inches of room here, and there's less than 1 inch in the front. So I'm actually going to bring up the fronts just a little bit, and you probably can't tell from this view, but the car actually has a little bit of front rake on it too, which is kind of a cool look if you have an E36 maybe, but not on the wagon. So I'm going to bring it up a little bit. It's 2 days in the future because that last clip you saw was taken at 9:30 in the evening that night when I started working. And it took me till 4 a.m. to make sure that I had the ride height correct. I had an alignment booked for the next morning that I intended on keeping the appointment for. And it took a long time. And it's not because it's relatively difficult to change the height. It's the fact that you got to take some stuff apart. You have to take out one of the pinch bolts where the little holder slides up on the bottom of the strut. You got to take out the lowest bolt there. You got to loosen up the end link. Like, it's not a joke to just like quickly do it. And also I found that the ratio of adjusting the threads on the collar didn't work 1-to-1 necessarily with the height on the exterior of the car. So it took me 3 attempts on the front left to get it. Then I think only like 2 on the other side, and I eventually gave up. I landed at pretty close to that 1.25 inch that I was shooting for. But I just want to show you something here. The rears have settled out just a little bit. I haven't measured this yet. I think it's closer to probably 1 inch. So it's not going to be, again, an exact science, and double again, you know, we're not racing teams here. It's not that important, but you're going to want to try to nail it as much as you can. Theoretically, the height of the car will affect the alignment, and that is exactly why I've settled on a height in the front that I do not have to change between seasons, because I don't want to pay for 2 $200 alignments a year. That's crazy. The other thing is the car is way too stiff on the setting of 16 front and rear. I'm about to adjust it. I think I'm actually going to knock it all the way back to like 25 out of 32. Like, again, this is just a comfortable wagon. This is for going to Costco. This isn't for loading up the suspension and high speed sweeping corners on a racetrack or something like that. So 16 is way too rough. I'd actually say it feels a lot like my S4, which even in that car is like not that comfortable, but at least it's expected for what that car is supposed to be. Not the case here at all. So I'm about to change the fronts. And again, this is why it's so helpful to modify the strut tower, because literally I can just go, I know I'm at 16, so I'm gonna go 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 3, 4, 5. Easy. Otherwise, I would have had to take a bunch of the suspension apart again. I could have affected my alignment negatively. Not the way to go. I was wrong in my favorite way. It's actually even easier than I said. When the wheel's in droop, you actually have enough room to just reach in and adjust it right at the top. So if you do that shock tower modification, you're golden on all 4 corners. I did take off a wheel though, because I wanted to show you how I used this. This is a bicycle chain lube, but what's interesting about it is that it's wax based. Now, it's not my genius idea. It came straight out of ECS Tuning's installation guide. They say to use a paraffin-based grease to lube up your shocks, actually. So I did all 4 corners when they were brand new. You can check out these pics I put on Instagram. And it leaves a nice little white coating, and it actually helps the collar spin a little bit. But what's great about it is that it's not sticky. It's not like an anti-seize that actually like would attract dirt and grime. This is a liquid when you put it on. In fact, I warmed it up a little bit beforehand. And within, I'd say even 30 seconds, it starts to harden. So what I did was I took my little bottle, I squirted it all over, and actually spun the collar all the way up and all the way back down. And that's what spread it through all the threads. And they look awesome so far, but I promise to actually check in a year from now, let's just say, and I bet you these things are going to be brand new and I can spin those collars no problem, but we'll put it to the test long term. And off we go on the most realistic suburban road test of all time. I'm going to take it through the current enemy of suburbia, which is speed bumps, uneven freeways, and sort of like uneven gravel roads of like, you know, a garden center or just like a dog park, something like that. And what I'll already say is I've made some adjustments since the last scene that we were looking at together, where I said I adjusted the car to 25 all the way around. I actually had 3 people in the back seat, and I was rubbing on the rear tires. And there's only so much I can do about that, and I know that making the rear shock stiffer is not necessarily like the solution to that problem. So what I've done now is actually change it a little bit one more time. So I'm running 28 in the front, and I'm running 20 in the rear. I figure if I get a little stiffness in the back, that might help some of the load that can be put on by, you know, having some passengers back there. Maybe you're going camping and the trunk is full, something like that. But in the front, I still really want a nice soft ride. And I found that 25 was definitely a step in the right direction, but it wasn't still quite as soft as what I was looking for. On my way to a local gravelly and kind of dippy place, just want you to get a sense of, how my body's moving and the road noise with the suspension. There's asphalt cracks filled in all over these roads. Pretty good. It's pretty quiet. Welcome to the beautiful late April, no leaves are up yet, Rainbow Valley Ski Club, walking trail and dog park. And here's our first gravel road test of the day here. So it is not paved at all, super uneven. Let's see how she feels. All right, I'm not gonna avoid any of the holes. This is like the OE factory test. That's not bad. That felt totally fine. I was not worried for the car at all doing that. One thing to know if you're visiting Edmonton is that we don't have concrete roads. We have asphalt-based roads, which means they shift terribly over the winter. They're not even, and the freeways are much like this. You're gonna be hopping around the whole time. But the extra thing is, where they join to bridges are never level. I don't know why they can't make them even, but you have that on one end of the bridge, and here comes another bump. And this will be a really good test. Here we go. Yeah, see? Not that bad. It's way worse in my S4. Just while I'm cruising to the speed bump, I just want to say that the car's actually more fun to drive now too. This has always been our utilitarian vehicle, and it's not really a fun ride, but now I actually feel like I can kind of get into it a little bit. I know it's not going to beat anybody on the road, and really the only looks it might get is for being lowered. I feel like wheels are one thing, but once you get lowered on wheels, the car sort of becomes, a bit of a nod. You're an enthusiast car. Okay, I gotcha. And last, the fabled speed bump. I actually had a hard time finding speed bumps around here to do this test. Here we go. Ooh, that was 10 kilometers an hour. Oh, here's a real gooder. The ground's completely tore up. Speed bump on the side. Not bad. One more. Oof. Big bump, but not uncomfortable. After watching that road test, I bet you're thinking a little bit more about what's going on inside of your wheel well when you're driving. And of course, you're not always driving in a straight line. Yes, you could tell from that road test that there's a lot of wheel articulation happening at all times, but if you are to turn where your wheel is outside of your fender well and you hit a speed bump, well, now you're going to be in trouble if you're too low. And I hope that just gets you thinking a little bit about your purchasing choices for coilovers, because obviously it's not just about how low you can go. That's where the rebound and compression settings might come in on different models. And there's just a lot of tuning to think about. Like, I've done 2 or 3 days now of tuning. I've made multiple adjustments, and I think I finally found a setting that I'm happy with, but there's just lots of factors to keep in mind. If I had to sum this entire video up into 4 categories where I rate things out of 10, here's my breakdown. Installation is probably a little trickier than you would anticipate. Not necessarily hard, but depending on the condition of your car, can be very involving. In my case, I would rate it a solid 7 out of 10 for overall time that it took and effort to install and tune. And that's category number 2, tunability. I would say with just the ability to 30-way tune the rebound damping, I would put this at about a 7 out of 10. Now for total ride comfort, what I was able to achieve, 8 out of 10. I think it is a great option, especially for its price, which is category number 4. Especially if you get these on sale, I think these are like a 9 out of 10 value. That is a wrap then on this video for my install and review. I genuinely hope this helped you make a decision on your own coilover purchasing journey. And let me know in the comments what you think about what you saw on the road test and my installation and how I gave these ratings overall. I'd love to hear them. Thank you so much for watching. Please do like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done that, and I'll see you next time.